Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Finding Islam podcast. My name is Abeer. I'm lifestyle editor for Finding Islam, and joined with two guests today. Joined with Zain, one of our editors, and also Abdullah, contributor and previous podcast attendee as well. So, Assalamu alaikum, guys. Jazakallah for coming today. Appreciate you guys being here. And the main conversation for today is something that I suppose is very relevant with Muslims at the minute and relevant in general, is essentially revolving around being capitalism and being a Muslim capitalist. You know, we're seeing, I think it's fair to say, a trend of many Muslims associating themselves with certain kind of, ideologies and kind of economic frames of mind, whether it be capitalism or socialism. Particularly the younger generation, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, have a tendency to kind of gravitate a bit towards socialism, as we've seen in the UK and even in America. But you have Muslims also who kind of associate themselves strongly with capitalism, the idea of the free market, and so on. And that's essentially what we're going to talk about today. So we'll kick right off into it, and a lot of the talking points that we'll be discussing are actually based off an article written by Zain, titled 5 Things Wrong with Being a Muslim Capitalist. And we'll kick right into it with the first point from the article. So capitalism encourages imperialism in the form of colonialism. So Zain, I'll let you take it away from here. So if you could maybe give us an idea of even what that phrase means. Capitalism encourages imperialism in the form of colonialism.
Sure. All right. Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah to you both, and jazakumullah khairan for bringing us on, Abeer. I suppose I'll preface this, the article I'd written and some of the points we were talking about, that, I suppose it's easier for people to assume that some economic ideologies are sort of like philosophically neutral, because economics doesn't necessarily have anything to do with, what I believe as a Muslim or how I feel about the world. And I think that's how you might very easily find people think themselves, I can be a Muslim capitalist or Muslim socialist or whatever else, because, economics is separate from Islam. And I think I think that's very much a mistake. I think that every economic ideology has baggage, philosophical baggage, especially when it's an ideology like capitalism, which is coming out of Europe. And the fact that capitalism grew along with the Enlightenment and grew with philosophical liberalism and these sort of things. So it's important to note that that there is harmful baggage for the well-being of a Muslim's faith that comes along with capitalism and other economic ideologies, or even just non-economic ideologies. And so on this first point, which I think is important to mention as an important thing for Muslims to understand about one of these pieces of baggage that comes with it's a major component of the things that encourage imperialism, and that's because if for a capitalist your primary objective is to maximize profits and to intelligently and effectively invest capital, and to that end you're going to reach a point where to continue to invest capital isn't possible in your country or where you are in the domestic area. If you're like a capitalist or a financier, you're going to reach a point where you run out of useful or cheap or effective opportunities for putting that capital to work, and that's where the necessity to export capital abroad comes in, to send capital away to other places and to put it to work, and then again to protect your capital. That obviously encourages the extension of imperialism and the preservation of that capital, by extending your power, if that sort of makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it's something that Lenin, Jean-Paul Sartre, Kwame Nkrumah out of Ghana, a lot of people have talked about. And it's something we very much saw in the 19th and 20th centuries. Europeans sent their colonists abroad. They'd send them to countries across Africa and Asia, South America, and they do so to they'd send their colonists, and their colonists were capitalists. They'd go over there, set up businesses, and extract resources out of those colonies. So it was their desire for new resources and new profits that sent them abroad. Not discounting other reasons for for imperialism, such as ideological reasons or whatever else. But yeah, it's something that's been very noticeable across the global South. It is the capitalist reasoning for imperialism and for the projection of power and for the acquisition of colonies and the theft of resources. And it's something that that Jean-Paul Sartre he uses the example of Algeria very usefully. He talked about how in Algeria, the colonists came and he set up businesses and extracted resources to send back to France. So he stole the resources of the native Muslim for the benefit of the colony. So he was like a trader between the colony and the metropole France. So it's I suppose it's something that's quite important to understand. That like you're there thinking, oh, Muslims like the free market, Muslims like free trade. It's true there are aspects of capitalism that are acceptable in Islam, but that doesn't undermine the fact that this imperial baggage accompanies the economic ideology. I feel like I've been a bit repetitive there in some of the things I've said, but I'm just trying to make sure that sort of makes sense to you both.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to kind of give someone, especially someone who perhaps isn't as familiar with what capitalism is and imperialism, what imperialism is, and how the two are interlinked, an idea of how they relate to each other and historically kind of how they relate to each other. Because, of course, we draw from a lot of the examples like you've given with Algeria and France. And there's countless examples like France and the US with Haiti, for example, as well as many other African nations that are still suffering from essentially the vacuum of their resources being taken away for the betterment of these other nations.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
And it's something that I think these days, especially when people think of capitalism, they think of it in that sense that it's there is no concern other than just the profits. At the end of the day, it's just the bottom line. Nothing else matters, which is where the discussion of kind of having more regulation and these things come in. But I suppose the flip side is people don't see what's, I suppose, the most common used alternative example is like socialism. They don't see socialism as something that is a practical alternative, essentially. And many, I think, Muslims as well, they take issue with socialism for arguably the same reasons that we should have issues with capitalism, that because, of course, maximizing profits, exploitation, these things are not compatible with our deen. Trade and these things certainly are, but fairness is always encouraged within Islam.
That's right. Yeah. No. In Islam, we have like our maqasid and our virtues guiding the application of Sharia, and that includes the application of economic rulings and the purpose of economics, and that's not something you're going to see if you engage with an ideology like capitalism or anything else. There's our virtues are not guiding those opinions.
So on this topic, if I was to ask you to define capitalism philosophically, so without the mention of money, how would you go about it, do you reckon?
Say it's an economic ideology that encourages the utilization of capital, and by capital we mean anything that's not anything man-made used in production. That's what capital is. So capitalism is focused around using around employing capital as the primary means of economic development or growth or whatever else,
As a kind of more broader, how would you describe that way of thinking, kind of in a not necessarily economic context, like the urge to kind of grow and build, this almost kind of cancerous kind of obsession, right? How would you describe that?
I describe that as a material philosophy. It's a philosophy of materialism that encourages attachment to worldly things and the physical world. It's not an ideology that has any space for the spiritual or anything that isn't I don't know, output. Well, so that's sort of how I describe it in non-economic terms, a material ideology. And that's, by the way, the same reason why you might take issue with socialism or another ideologies, is at the end of the day, they're focused around material analysis. And we don't take, akhira and, the worship of Allah out of our analyses as Muslims. So
I think you're right that Muslims in this context take issue with socialism for that reason. I think me personally, and I assume others, also take issue with the fact that socialism as a philosophy sees human beings as units, and it's not as kind of free agents, right? It sees them as numbers and statistics, and it's about systems, right? The state is a system, humans are a system, workers are systems. No matter how much you talk about giving rights to workers and this and that, at the end of the day, workers are an industry, and the only difference is that,
yeah.
The
focus there is labor
exactly.
instead of capital. Yeah,
exactly. And so you have a system in which human beings don't have free will; they're denied free will. It's kind of the typical utopia, right? A utopia is kind of like, everyone does their own little job in their world and they work towards the betterment of the state. It's not about the individual, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess this is the attraction that Muslims may have to capitalism. It's the absolute opposite, right? Yeah. It's all about the individual. It's about the free will. Yeah. But then what happens is in kind of achieving one's free will, you're denying others' free will, just like you've explained in your imperialism question. So as in many things in dunya and deen, in life and in religion, the middle way is often the best, isn't it?
Well, that's right, exactly. And that actually is a very important point what you just mentioned. It's because capitalism and imperialism, they grew along with the modern Western philosophy of liberalism, which encourages individualism, and it's like you're saying that in these economic ideologies, the person is just seen as a unit and as an atomized individual, and similarly in I suppose liberalism which is the corresponding ideology on a philosophical level to capitalism, is that it's all about the person and his the person and ownership and property. So I don't want to diverge too much, but there's a whole connection there between these different Enlightenment ideologies.
Absolutely, yeah. It's something that kind of it traps you. Just as like we see the dunya as something that traps, kind of sucks us in. Capitalism seems to have the same effect. Like there's no way essentially out of this system without dismantling the entire system, because it's fully built on. Well, it's built on capitalism. Essentially, it's built as we're seeing now on these kind of mega corporations with higher net worths than most countries these days.
That's right.
And you see the effect it has on many smaller countries, many Muslim countries, many of these countries that are still, like Algeria, for example, are on the back of their colonial past and just still somewhat fresh as independent nations. And for these nations as well, if you look at how they're supposed to kind of build up their economy, how they're supposed to actually, I suppose, bring money in, it's by engaging in these same systems. Like we're seeing, for example, the rise of China, many Chinese companies that are actively taking, I suppose, setting up in many African nations, China's partnership with Pakistan and kind of the involvement of Chinese companies in infrastructure there, for example. And, yes, of course, with just as with China, as we have issues with, France's take on because of their colonial past, but also their current stance on Muslims, we have that issue, of course, with China and the Uyghur Muslims. But for the position of these nations, they're left in a position of, well, what are we supposed to do? Because to even catch up as such, because they're in such debt, they essentially have to engage in these same systems. And that's kind of, I suppose, the growing fear that we have with nations like even Afghanistan, which is progressing into a sort of a new age now with the departure of the U.S. military, how will they cope, I suppose, with being on the world stage now? And how are they supposed to grow? Same with like the likes of Libya and Syria, and you think of the devastation these countries have had. How can they grow without getting sucked into this, very profit-driven, by any profit by all means systems, basically, even at the cost of their own exploitation? So that was a bit of a rambly sentence, but I hope that the idea gets across.
It makes complete sense. It's about the pervasiveness of global capitalism and how there isn't really any alternatives but to participate in that international financial capitalist system. You're a new country on the block. You're like, hey, I'm Afghanistan or Syria. I'm just here ready to reintegrate into the global system. It's like, great, to the IMF and take out a loan. Like those are the options. And it is, I suppose, just an issue that I don't, off the top of my head, have any answers to. But let's put that on the to-do list.
At risk of going slightly off topic, as I have a habit of doing, the question to perhaps both of you is, apart from the fact that this domination that we talk about today is purely economic. In terms of relationships between powers, the dominating powers and the dominated, is this system of, capitalism, as we've called it, is it specifically attached to the Enlightenment onwards? Or is it just a continuation of the classical Dar al-Harb, like understanding of just empires and civilizations and countries using their power against each other? Other than the fact that, of course, it's different because it's purely economic and it's not military anymore most of the time. Is there something uniquely different about this power struggle, this power balancing, that perhaps comes from the Enlightenment? Or is it just another way of the old school empires fighting each other kind of thing, re-showing itself?
I think it's a bit of both. Like throughout history, there have been power imbalances and the desire for projecting power and imperial power. That's always been something in history, and I'm sure there's someone who's more qualified to speak about that. But in terms of the post-Enlightenment period, there's definitely been a change behind at least the Western motivations for imperialism. The modern Western experience of imperialism is very much informed by the Enlightenment, which encouraged the proliferation of their ideology, and the like I said, that capitalist impetus of acquiring resources and acquiring power. So it has more specifically attributable characteristics because of the Enlightenment in the modern period, which I'm sure just build on top of those the longer history of desiring power. And that's something you see both during the colonial period with the spread of Christian missionaries and the acquisition of colonies, and in the modern period with America invading Iraq and Afghanistan with very ideological motivations behind spreading liberal democracy, so it's I suppose a bit of both. Before the Enlightenment and after the Enlightenment both have their own motivations, which have maintained in a very harmful way. I think I was reading very recently actually that it's like some American analyst was saying, when America goes abroad and tries to slap on democracy in a year or two in another country, then that country has just received the ass end of imperialism. It's a funny quote, but it's true. Yeah. And I think this will tie in to our next talking point about neo-colonialism whenever we're ready to move on.
Yeah, I think we can head there now, actually. So capitalism encourages imperialism in the form of neo-colonialism. So I suppose, what does neo-colonialism mean exactly, for people who don't know?
Well, yeah, so I specified in my article that that capitalism encourages imperialism, and then I did another part about how capitalism encourages imperialism as neo-colonialism. So it's easy to conceptualize, I suppose, imperialism in the colonial form, because imperialism is the extension of power, and however that might be political, military, economic, but then colonialism and neo-colonialism are manifestations of imperialism. So it's easy to conceptualize colonialism, and that's why I gave the example of Algeria and France and how they came in to acquire resources. But it's often harder to see neo-colonialism, and so it's good to talk about that. Kwame Nkrumah, he's the Ghanaian revolutionary who defined and coined the term neo-colonialism. He specifically said, neo-colonialism is where a country seems to have all the trappings of sovereignty. It seems independent, and yet its economic and political policy is directed from the outside. So neo-colonialism is it's the next stage of colonialism, and it's where a country isn't directly the colony of a European or foreign power, but they're under its influence in an economic or political or military or cultural way, and that's neo-colonialism. And that can exist for so many reasons, but it continues to. Again, capitalism is a big reason for why it continues to exist, because it is a form of imperialism. And so today, when we see the fact that oftentimes Western countries, America, France, the United Kingdom, or increasingly China, have economic interests in a place like Africa, or maybe South America, and they are often driven by their interests are often driven by money and resources. They in order to put their capital to the best use, and in order to invest their capital and acquire resources, then they're encouraged to exert power over the places where their capital is put to use. So that, for example, you'll see America and its desire to control oil and access to oil in the Middle East resulted in some very harmful wars. You'll see China in sub-Saharan Africa, and China being the largest trade partner of Africa in the modern age, often exerts imperial power over certain sub-Saharan African countries due to their economic interests in the continent. So it's something to, I suppose, differentiate from the history of foreign powers coming to the global south to exert power, to exert imperialism for that capitalist reasoning. It continues to exist in the neo-colonial form of imperialism, and I hope that sort of made sense.
Yeah,
sort of jumbled.
No, that's good. I think that's because I think often with these terms it can get confusing for a lot of people. These phrases tend to get thrown around a lot, so it's good to kind of just get a definition for them and get some context, basically. But that makes sense, and it's definitely as relevant as always. This concept.
That's right. It's important to note that although we're in a post-colonial age for the most part, besides Israel and maybe a few other places, we're not in a post-imperial age. So formal colonization is mainly ended, but imperialism maintains. And so often that the way it maintains is through neo-colonialism.
We're glad you bring this up because I think it's important to point this out, that we don't live in some sort of progressive global politics. And in many ways, I think I'm probably the minority in seeing it this way. The kind of the dynamics we have between powers and quote unquote oppressed populations is no different really to any other time in history, right? I mean, the UN is a great smokescreen to say that we don't have this kind of dog eat dog interaction anymore, but it's just completely not substantiated, right? I mean, we objectively live in the most violent period in human history, and like this discussion is showing, that violence is now not directed physically or militarily. That violence is directed economically, the reason why it's important to point this out is because if we start with the premise, as we do in almost every conversation these days, as quote unquote minorities, as quote unquote oppressed people, right? If we start with the assumption that we are, we're being oppressed against, and it's because they've made a mistake, and we just need to explain, and then everything will be fine because people will realize that they were wrong, and they'll say sorry, and it'll be fine. As opposed, it's like these people have gone off track, and we just need to show them that they're wrong. And the question here is this understanding that, well, it was never fair, and it's not supposed to be fair. The people who are running X don't intend for it to be fair. What has that understanding? What does that imply now? And what does that mean for the way we approach things? As opposed to the kind of, but the UN's a thing, and that way of seeing the world, which is very popular, especially in young people. I mean, it's the classic, like with everything. It's just this underlying belief that we expected it to be any different. It's like, the EU's passed a law that legislates acceptance of being anti-hijab, like, surprise, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Like, what does it mean when we change our understanding? Maybe in economic terms. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think you're talking about
makes sense.
About how a bit about the idea of moral progress and how the myth of it. And
yes. And once you break that smoke screen, what does it mean for the way you see the world? How does it change?
I think since the Enlightenment, there's definitely been a very strong idea that all of humanity is progressing in morality. There's this myth of moral progress, that we're moving towards this end point, and that we're consistently improving in terms of our moral and economic and political governance, and that it's all just getting better. And I think that's a very pervasive idea that today we're civilized and things are better than before. It's just a widely believed and accepted idea. And I think what we don't necessarily always realize is that idea is just very Eurocentric. That idea believes that all of human history up until the Enlightenment was just stepping stones to get there, and then now the future is the European Western experience for us all to embrace. And the more we embrace it, the more we've progressed. And so when we as Muslims, for example, see the banning of hijab in Europe, and for us that's so clearly not our idea, but it is hailed to be so. It's because the idea of progress and the idea of modernity is so strongly a Eurocentric idea. So it's going to be natural, I think, for any God-fearing Muslim who sees the many issues in the world today that are problematic for us and for what we believe in. It's impossible not to discount this idea of moral progress. So often we look to the past and to the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he perfected good character, and perfected morality. So how are we? It's impossible for us to discount the past and discount history. And it's something that there's a writer called Christopher Latch. He says that you know that you have entered like a culture of narcissism, and individualism when you completely devalue the past. So yes, I think it's, and I think that definitely extends in economic terms, that we're supposed to accept that capitalism is the end of history in terms of economics. Here we are, we made it. Let's just stick with this forever. It definitely extends, I think, in economic terms. And unfortunately, the rise of China has actually only supported that, because China has completely embraced capitalism and is the major competitor to, Euro-American capitalism. Is the main competitor, just its own form of capitalism. So it's, again, it doesn't really help us to dispel the myth of progress in moral terms or economic terms.
Yeah.
As Muslims, our approach is usually very easy. And the reason it is because it becomes difficult when you get confused between ways of seeing the world, right? If you have this cognitive dissonance that this Western machine that I've grown in, it's supposed to be good, and maybe it's just malfunctioning. I need to take it to the mechanic, and it'll be fine after that. If you take that away, you fall back on, okay, then if this isn't the way that the world's going to get better, and if this isn't the way to see the world, then what is? Oh, I'm a Muslim. It's the Sirah, it's the Sunnah, right? It's our tradition. And so in many things, we find that reform Islamically is coming back to the path, right? As opposed to reform in a material sense.
In a way, destroying the past, really.
Exactly. It's a way. It's kind of it's a circus show. It's kind of who can make the most colorful poster, right? And it's kind of who can invent the font that nobody's seen before. So it's a way of making things that nobody's seen before. But our reform this is the haq, because this is objective, right? Because the colorful posters come when there's no objectivity. So you're just kind of you're starting with something else because you're bored of the last thing. When you have an objective path, all your reform is every time you go off, you kind of come back. You go off, you come back. And so our mujaddids, right? Our reformers, and just a reminder, reform is a part of the religion. When you see religion not reforming, when you see difficult conversations about how Islam needs to change not happening, that means that there's a problem. Because, excuse me, it's stuck. There we are. Ali Izzat-Begovic, rahimahullah, he said religion and art are similar, right? They're both pure in as long as they're struggling, and as soon as they become established, they die, right? And this is the Islamic concept of ijtihad. This is the idea that we're not supposed to be set in stone. We're supposed to be. So you have, sorry to go all the way off the topic, but we have this understanding of objective truth. This is objective truth. This is what we call Sharia, right? And then we have fiqh, which is the human attempt to access Sharia, right? This is not the objective truth, but this is what we think is as close as we can get to the objective. But we recognize that we are just eternally evolving to try and get closer and closer to this. We're eternally trying to get back to that middle path. And so in economic terms, Zain and perhaps Abeer, is the solution to produce a Islamic manifesto for economics, and that is inspired by this middle path, that is inspired by the Sirah, and propagating that as a alternative model, or is it something different?
It's a good question. I think the easy answer is yes, that should be the aim, but I suppose the difficulty is what does that actually mean? Especially in the context of today, we don't really have any examples of an Islamic kind of economic system. At least attempts are being made, for example, in the finance sector of there being halal bonds, halal mortgage options, things like that, or Islamic mortgage options, all that kind of stuff. But it really just seems like those are just kind of the normal versions of those things, just changed slightly or reworded slightly.
Did you see the 95% halal mortgage, right? Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't.
95% halal, and then there's a 5% left. You may as well just get a normal mortgage then, right?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing. Yeah, it's Zan's the one who has studied economics. So he probably has a better idea. But he's, for me, anyways, as a kind of a layman, I can't even imagine really what an Islamic system, that's especially one that's all encompassing in this, what that would entail.
Mm-hmm. No, I think I really agree with what Abeer said. Obviously the easy answer is yes. It'd be nice to have an Islamic economic system, but I don't know. I don't think it'd be. I think I think it's really sort of something that's very tied into politics, that, so we need Muslim politics to really progress before we can start thinking about that. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the economics comes first, there's so many components for so much progress that Muslims need to make in so many areas, whether it be in our cultural integration and cultural produce, or whether talking about, the proliferation of healthier and more moral politics in our lands. And again, then they're talking about which comes first, or do they come together? You can't have healthy politics until you have a healthy Muslim culture, or can't have healthy economics until you have the political culture that allows it. So I don't know what comes first, but I think
it's
like holistic.
These things rely on each other, right?
It's a system.
Yeah, and I think if we're doing it again, right? If we approach this with a Western way of looking at things,
that's right.
A deconstructed kind of way of looking at things, that there's so many different aspects that we need to achieve. It's kind of a fallacy, because the way that the Western philosophy achieves these things is it kind of props these things up individually, right? That's the way that we deconstruct everything and everything's on its own.
Exactly.
But the way our tradition does things is one thing grows from another, and this thing relies on this, and this thing flourishes from this. So in reality, when you have every professional doing their job, Zain's doing his economics, perhaps I'm doing my architecture, Abeer's doing his engineering, in an inherently sincere way to our tradition, they help each other, right? SubhanAllah, like my blank. I'll get back to where I was going. But yeah, you just got the first half of what I was saying.
I think I know where you're going, is that, it's almost, we don't need to worry too much about creating a specific sort of system, rather than just doing things correctly and according to Sharia, and that system that system will emerge. We don't, there isn't like an Islamic system, an economic system in the Quran and Sunnah that you're going to find a big list of rules, this is what you do. But there are principles, and once we're following the principles and growing a healthy society, then it's just natural that healthy economic and political systems will emerge. Once we're, correctly observing Quran and Sunnah and our moral and virtue, our morals and our virtues. So
the anxiety, exactly. The anxiety we have in kind of, we need to do all these things, is a secular anxiety, because the secular mind is, I need to invent this.
Exactly. Yeah.
I need to invent this, because everything is new. We don't believe that. We believe that there is a right way of doing things objectively. I need to get to this, not invent it. I need to get to it. It's already there.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so every step that I take in a good direction, which I can measure in my own means that I'm getting closer to this. Like we said, we're getting closer to the path. We're not seeking a new crazy thing. There is it's like Plato's, I don't know if you guys are fans of Plato. Plato has the word of forms, right? Forms is kind of, exactly. So you have like a glass. There is a perfect glass in Plato's world.
An ideal.
Yeah, this is just a manifestation of that perfect model. This is one of the examples of it. And every step you take towards that, there is a perfect model. That's the point. There is a perfect model, right? We don't need to invent some crazy thing.
That's right.
So every step we take in a good direction will take us there. Every time we make that sphere, like it all goes together. I don't know if you guys remember that thread that I hosted, right, about the butterfly effect.
Everyone doing their part.
And it does, because you can't believe in an objective truth without believing this, right? I don't know. Best way to answer something, isn't it? Yeah, I don't know.
I think that's a very it's a really manageable way of thinking about things. Instead of worrying how are we going to establish any sort of Islamic economic system that encourages equity, just take steps and do our part. And in terms of encouraging good, healthy trends in economics, or in other spheres, like even like, for example, the cultural sphere, something like, say, Earth Rule, which everyone loves talking about, that's a manifestation of someone going out there and thinking, look, I want to create a program that makes Islam attractive and encourage and gives da'wah, and it's a good, healthy Islamic output. And whoever that person was, he made that show, and boom, it's a step in the right direction, and it's touching a lot of hearts. It's just, making that move, flapping those butterfly wings.
We're seeing as well, even without the Islamic context, that when a system is clearly flawed and not for the benefit of the majority of people, that frustration can lead to someone creating something that is a better alternative. Like, for example, Bitcoin. Bitcoin was essentially born because of not that I'm promoting Bitcoin or anything, but it was born. use my affiliate link. It'll be in the. But it was born essentially because of the issue of inflation and, of course, the massive recession. Particularly the 2008 crash, which it had no impact essentially on the majority of the banks and the bankers who are responsible for it, but it bankrupted people, ruined people's lives, and it's taken like a decade for the economy to even recover really from it. And Bitcoin was essentially born out of the idea of this gives control to the average consumer. It's not something that is going to, the value can't be, I suppose, manipulated by inflation due to just pumping, like you print money, which causes inflation. And it was born from that kind of idea, basically, of having something like gold, essentially like a digital gold. And since then, we've seen that field, kind of cryptocurrencies and that kind of digital finance area explode, and it's still in its infancy, but there's a lot of interesting ideas being developed within that space that could, it's too early to tell exactly what the impact will be, especially on a finance or economic level, but it could have implications are huge. Like there's some projects there's some projects that, for example, are aiming particularly and being adopted like in Africa, for example, or in some more developing countries. And it was it. What country was it? I think it was No, it wasn't Venezuela. It was
Uruguay, Paraguay, one of those.
I have to Google it now because I forget. But they adopted Bitcoin. Yeah, it was adopted as national currency, basically, by some Latin nation, and I've completely forgotten. El Salvador. It was El Salvador. That's who. El Salvador. And it's just a prime. I often look at that as you can have your issues with the crypto space. It certainly isn't perfect, but at least this is something different that's trying to deal with an existing problem. The problem of inflation, the problem of market instability, and the problem that ultimately it's not this market that's been created. It is not to benefit you as the average consumer. It's to benefit the hedge funds and the people in the know, Wall Street and so on. So they're taking kind of, as you guys have both said, small steps, creating alternatives, which we are starting to see now, with in the Muslim community, both culturally and even kind of practically in things like kind of the finance area and so on, and investing. That should, inshallah, lead us towards that right direction, I think. And I think that's a lot better than just kind of saying we need to change everything and then not actually being able to do it, because changing everything is just impossible to do that all at once.
Just a heads up that over here it's another time, so I'd appreciate if we jump off, inshallah, soon. But we've got three things here, right? We've got capitalism as a philosophy. We've got quote unquote, I'll say communism as a philosophy, and then we're proposing something. Capitalism, as an idea, it says we keep striving more and more and more, and we keep going exponentially towards our goals. And in reaction to it, you have, like we said at the start, often young people who run towards a framework that just kind of gobbles everything up and wants to fix everything all at once, which is socialism. I mean, I'm not a fan of socialism, so I'll just say it straight up. Like, it's this utopian view that we have, like, any intervention we make in the world has to be towards this perfect fix, right? That, the communists, I mean, they thought they were making heaven on earth, essentially. Socialism, that is the idea, it's utopia. And so there is no space for disagreement or dissent. It's kind of, this way is the perfect way, do not disagree with me. Capitalism is kind of the opposite. It's kind of, now, what Islam and Islamic tradition says is that, yes, there is a perfect way to live, like we said. And there is a perfect model. There is a perfect form. But that is like the Sharia, like the law, the divine law, as God intends it. And then the role of the human is to develop fiqh, like Islamic jurisprudence, Islamic law, which is intending to get as close as possible to this as possible as it can. But it's not saying, like a communist, that I have the Sharia like here, and you must follow me. And if you don't follow me, you are going against God's law, because that's what extremists do. So you have terrorism and communism in the same philosophy in that way, right? It's kind of, this is the perfect way. Do not disagree with me. What traditional Islamic law says, and this is interesting, and this is why people get confused about this, because they come at this from a Western way of looking at things. Islamic law says, you have this opinion, I have this opinion. They're different opinions for the same question, and they're both correct. Right? It doesn't say this is the objectively correct one, this is the wrong one, because it recognizes that they're both attempts to reach this. They are not this, right? As opposed to say, if you disagree with this one, you're not, right? That's extremism. The authentic way is to say, this is the best I've done. This is what I've intended for God. Everything else, any mistakes are from myself. Anything good is from God. Literally, because anything good is from God's system. That's literally what it means, right? And so what we need to, I guess, put forward in anything is just little attempts to get closer to that truth. And what's empowering about that is everybody works towards it. You don't need this overarching system, because like we said, the overarching system is inherently oppressive. It works from people like us. And you have this kind of grassroots movement that becomes a butterfly effect, to kind of use the cliche that I used before.
Yeah.
Inshallah.
It's honestly something that kind of, I think it should instill hope. The fact that we're through kind of collaboration and just small efforts that we can make something better, inshallah. I think that it's for me anyway, it feels very hopeful that we have that to hold on to as Muslims.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, it's interesting you mention that, guys, because and it's one of the reasons that I'm writing this article about capitalism, is that so often that you see young people so ambitious in terms of dunya, in terms of the acquisition of wealth. They want to be like, they admire Elon Musk or Bill Gates or whoever else, because these are people who have mastered the economic system. They've reached the top, and why that's so problematic is just like you guys are saying. We need people to be ambitious in their Islam and making efforts in their Islam and trying to achieve big things or small things for the betterment of Muslims. That's really where we want to be directing ourselves, and those actions that you would take and those virtues that you would sort of that you would hold are a natural result of admiring someone like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and not Elon Musk. It's just about priorities as well. And then that's and that's, you can see why. It's like we were talking about earlier about the pervasiveness of capitalism as an ideology and how that distracts us away from what we should be doing. It's that materialism and that attachment to dunya and that distraction, that trap, I think was what Abeer said earlier. So yes, it's good to be acknowledging both the problem, this pervasive capitalism, and then the solution. Adherence to Islam, admiration, and following the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's a really, really nice note to end it on. Honestly, this is such a big topic, and I know we didn't even hit every aspect of the article. We may do a part 2 of this to discuss it further. I'm just conscious of time, and it is Maghrib now as well.
Yeah, but just to summarize for anyone who's listening, just know that anything that you do in emulation or service of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the best of creation sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is a service to his ummah, is a service to your fellow Muslims, and is furthering kind of the deen in this dunya and in your akhirah. Like, nothing is insignificant, right? And so make an effort to work from an Islamic motivation, right, and not from a monetary motivation or from a framework motivation. Do it for the Prophet's nation.
Yes, Abdullah. That's very very nice message to end it on. And I appreciate you guys donating your time, and hopefully for all of you listening or watching, this is beneficial, and inshallah we'll see you on the next one. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Jazakumullah khair.